Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
All right, strap in everyone, because today we're diving headfirst into the world of global tech policy. We're talking U.S. and Australia, trade tensions, and specifically how the Trump administration's policies might impact Australia when it comes to, well, all things tech.
It's a fascinating story. It's not just about tariffs and trade deals. It really gets to the core of how countries are grappling with the immense power of these global tech giants.
Exactly. And our guide for this deep dive is a Sydney Morning Herald article titled, Get This, Trump's Tariff Threat to Australia Over Tech Regulations. It all revolves around this memo that President Trump issued. Essentially, the U.S. is saying, hey, any country out there with policies we see as harmful to our tech giants, we're ready to fight back.
Right. And this memo is a pretty clear signal that we're seeing Trump's America First agenda playing out on the global tech stage. You know, think back to how he used tariffs on things like steel and aluminum to protect American industries. Well, now he seems to be applying that same kind of pressure tactic, but in the digital world.
So what kind of policies are we talking about here? The article mentions things like digital services, taxes, regulations that give an advantage to local companies over U.S. firms, even content quotas on streaming services.
Yeah, it's a whole arsenal of potential trade weapons, and Australia seems to be, well, right in the crosshairs.
Yeah, for sure. The article points out a few specific Australian policies that have Washington a little worried. First up is the News Bargaining Code, which could potentially force companies like Google and Meta to pay Australian news outlets for using their content.
And from the U.S. perspective, it looks a lot like Australia trying to funnel money away from American companies and straight into their own.
Right. Like, hey, you're making money off our news, you got to share the wealth.
Exactly.
And then there are these potential regulations on things like digital wallets and payment platforms. You know, we all use Apple Pay or Google Pay without a second thought, but these new rules could really change how we pay for things online.
Imagine your favorite Australian wine suddenly costing, like, 20% more because of tariffs. That's the kind of impact we're talking about here.
Oh, ouch. Yeah, that would definitely make me rethink my next bottle of Shiraz.
Yeah.
And let's not forget about those past proposals to impose content quotas on U.S. streaming platforms, even though they're kind of on hold for now. It still shows that Australia isn't afraid to stand up to American tech companies.
And that's exactly what has the U.S. worried. They see these policies as a form of protectionism. It's like each country is trying to build a wall around its own industries to shield them from foreign competition. But we've seen this before, right? It can really backfire and lead to higher prices and less choice for consumers.
So basically, they're in this high-stakes chess match.
Exactly. And the stakes get even higher when you factor in the potential for a full-blown trade war. Remember those steel and aluminum tariffs a few years back?
Yeah.
Those had ripple effects way beyond just the metal industries. Imagine what a tech-focused trade war could do.
So is Trump basically saying that these foreign governments are straight up plundering American tech companies?
Well, he's certainly using some strong language.
But then, isn't this whole argument for a level playing field a little hypocritical? I mean, U.S. tech giants got where they are by operating in a pretty unregulated environment for a long time, right?
That's a great point, and it gets right to the heart of the debate. Is there actual evidence to back up this claim of plundering? We really need to look at specific policies and see if they're truly unfair or not.
On the other hand, you've got these tech giants raking in huge profits, arguably contributing less to local economies than traditional businesses.
Exactly. It's a super complex situation. There are valid points on both sides, and the lines get blurry really quickly. So what does fair competition even look like in this new digital world? Who gets to set the rules? That's the question.
Well, let's try to untangle at least one thread of this web. Let's talk about that Australian News Bargaining Code, because it seems to be a major sticking point. It's complicated, but the article does a decent job of breaking down how it works.
Yeah. The core idea is to force platforms like Google and Meta to share a piece of the pie, the revenue they generate from news content, with the publishers who are actually creating that content. It's basically saying, look, you can't just use our news for free. You've got to pay for it.
And what if they can't agree on a price?
That's where it gets really interesting. An independent body would step in to determine what a fair rate would be. This is supposed to prevent the tech giants from just dictating the terms. But even with all that, there's no guarantee it'll actually work.
The article mentioned some pretty harsh criticism of the code from people like Elon Musk. He called it an attempt to dominate the online lives of citizens. What do you make of that?
It really speaks to this broader fear that governments are overstepping their boundaries, that they're trying to control what people can see and do online. It's a slippery slope argument. But, I mean, it does resonate with a lot of people who are wary of giving governments too much power over the internet.
So could this code actually work? Force these giants to pay up?
It's definitely possible. Australia's model has actually inspired similar legislation in other countries, so it's a trend worth watching. But it's still early days, so it's hard to say what the long-term impact will be.
It's fascinating to see this power dynamic play out between these huge tech companies and governments.
Yeah.
You got these platforms like Google and Meta that operate across borders, basically creating their own digital ecosystems.
And then you have individual countries trying to assert their own sovereignty and protect their interests within those ecosystems. It's a tough spot to be in.
It's kind of like the Wild West out there, everyone trying to figure out the rules of the game as they go along. But the article does a good job explaining the Australian government's justification for the code. They're saying it's necessary to address this imbalance of power between tech companies and news publishers.
Right. The argument is that these platforms are basically getting rich off news content without properly compensating the people who produce it. And that's threatening the future of traditional journalism, which they say is vital for a healthy democracy. It's definitely a concern a lot of countries are starting to share. Of course, the tech companies have their side of the story, too. They say, hey, we're already driving tons of traffic to news websites. Shouldn't that be enough?
Right. It's like we're doing you a favor by bringing you readers.
Exactly. They're also worried about potential censorship and government overreach. If governments can force platforms to pay for news, what's to stop them from using that as leverage to control what kind of news gets shared?
So the concern is that governments could start picking and choosing which news we see.
It's a slippery slope argument, no doubt, but it's a worry that a lot of people share.
So where do you see this all heading? Is this news bargaining code going to become the new normal?
It's tough to say for sure, but it's definitely gaining traction. Like I said, other countries are starting to follow Australia's lead. The pressure on tech companies to address these concerns isn't going away, and the more they push back, the more likely it is that governments are going to crack down.
It's a high-stakes game of chicken. And the stakes are even higher when you think about the bigger geopolitical picture. We're seeing this rise of nationalism and protectionism around the world.
And tech policy is becoming a flashpoint.
Because it's not just about economics anymore, right?
No.
It's about national security, cultural influence, even the future of the internet as we know it.
Absolutely. The U.S. in particular sees their dominance in tech as a major strategic asset.
And they're not going to let other countries chip away at that without a fight.
Exactly. Trump's memo makes it pretty clear that the U.S. is willing to throw its weight around to protect their tech companies, and Australia is just one many countries caught in the middle of all this.
The article also mentioned other policies that could attract the U.S.'s attention. Things like regulations on those digital wallets and payment platforms we were talking about.
Right.
And those past proposals to impose content quotas on U.S. streaming platforms. Those were seen as a direct threat to companies like Netflix and Disney Plus, Spence.
It all boils down to this fundamental tension between national interests and the free flow of information and commerce. Countries want to protect their own industries and make sure their citizens have access to local content, but they also don't want to stifle innovation or create trade barriers.
It's a tough balancing act. This whole situation is really forcing us to rethink the role of government in the digital age. For a long time, the internet was this unregulated space where governments had very little influence.
That's definitely changing.
As the internet becomes more and more central to our lives, governments are starting to realize they need to play a more active role in shaping its development.
And that's leading to a lot of friction. This U.S.-Australia spat is a perfect example.
It's a really complex story, and it's still unfolding, but let's bring it down to earth for a minute. What does all this mean for the average person?
That's what we need to talk about. Even if you don't work in tech or follow international trade, this stuff can have a real impact on your life.
We were just talking about how this whole U.S.-Australia tech policy thing is like the Wild West, right? Everyone's figuring out the rules as we go.
It really is uncharted territory. And one of the toughest challenges is finding that balance, between a country's right to regulate what happens within its own borders and the reality that the internet is global.
Yeah, because you can't exactly build a wall around the internet, can you?
Exactly. Information crosses borders so easily These tech companies operate on a global scale. So how do you even enforce national regulations when the playing field is basically the entire world? It's the million-dollar question.
Trying to herd cats. But, okay, before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's circle back to Australia's news bargaining code for a second. We've touched on the arguments, but I want to dig a little deeper into Australia's thinking. What's their main reason for putting this code in place?
It's all about leveling the playing field. Their argument is news organizations put a ton of time and money into producing real journalism, and then platforms like Google and Facebook come along and benefit without having to contribute.
So it's like Google's getting a free lunch, basically.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it's not just about profits either. Australia argues that this whole setup threatens the future of real journalism, which they say is essential for a democracy to function.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
You know, without reliable news sources, it's so much easier for misinformation to spread, which can really destabilize things.
Makes sense. But the tech companies aren't just going to take this lying down, right?
Right. Of course not. Their main argument is that they're already sending tons of traffic to news websites. Think about it. People click on links in their search results or on social media, and that sends them straight to the original news source. They say they're providing a valuable service by helping people discover this content in the first place.
So they're basically saying, hey, we're already helping you out. We're bringing you all these readers.
Exactly. And they also argue that having to pay for links to news articles could be a real financial burden, especially for smaller platforms.
Plus, there's that whole censorship issue, right?
Oh, absolutely. They're worried that if governments can force platforms to pay for news, that gives them a way to influence what kind of news gets shared. Like, imagine a government putting pressure on a platform to favor news from certain outlets or to bury stories that are critical of the government.
So they're saying this could lead to a situation where the government is basically controlling what news we see.
Right. And that's a pretty scary thought for anyone who cares about freedom of the press and the free flow of information.
It seems like there are some good points on both sides of this argument. But where do you see this going? Do you think Australia's model is going to catch on in other countries?
Hard to say for sure, but it's definitely a trend worth watching. Other countries are wrestling with these same questions, and a lot of them are looking to Australia for inspiration.
So even if it doesn't become the standard everywhere, it's definitely shaking things up and making tech companies rethink how they deal with news publishers.
Oh, for sure. And the pressure on these companies is just going to keep building. They're facing scrutiny from all directions, regulators, lawmakers, even just everyday people. The more they resist, the more likely it is that governments are going to step in and take a harder line.
Sounds like a pretty high-stakes game of chicken.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not just talking about the future of news here. This is about the future of the internet, period.
You're right. And this isn't just about Australia and the U.S. This is a global issue that affects everyone. Other countries are watching this whole thing very closely, and they're likely to adjust their own policies based on what happens.
Speaking of other countries, the article mentions that the U.S. is particularly concerned about regulations on things like digital wallets and payment platforms. That sounds like a whole other can of worms.
Oh, it is. And this is something that could directly affect your life. Think about it. You probably use Apple Pay or Google Pay pretty often. These regulations could change the fees that companies have to pay, which could end up costing you more every time you buy something.
So this isn't just tech companies arguing with each other. It could hit us right in the wallet.
It's a real possibility. And then there's the whole data privacy angle. These regulations could change how companies store and use your financial data. It's a really complicated and constantly changing landscape. We definitely need to keep an eye on it.
It feels like we're barely scratching the surface of something huge and complicated here.
You're not wrong. And one of the things that makes this so tricky is that technology moves so fast. What's new and innovative today could be old news tomorrow. Regulators are always trying to play catch up.
It's like trying to hit a moving target.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to stay informed and engaged in this conversation. This isn't just about governments and big corporations. It's about what kind of digital world we want to live in and what role we want technology to play in our lives.
I like that. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what this all means for the average person. Even if we're not directly involved in setting these policies, these trends can have real-world effects on us. Okay, so we talked a lot about this clash between the U.S. and Australia, global tech policies, trade tensions, all that. But let's get real. What does it all mean for the average person who isn't, a tech CEO or a trade negotiator?
That's the question, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, this isn't just some kind of theoretical debate happening in the halls of power. These decisions have very real consequences for everyone.
The article we've been discussing mentions some pretty unsettling stuff, actually. For example, it talks about how some of these regulations from other countries could really weaken freedom of speech and political engagement online.
Yeah, that's something that goes way beyond just the U.S. It's a global concern. As governments everywhere try to figure out this whole internet thing, there's a real danger that they could overreach, that they might try to control too much.
So you're saying we could end up with an internet that's not as free and open as it is now?
Yeah.
Where certain voices get shut down or some information is suppressed.
It's definitely a possibility, and it's something we need to watch very carefully. Because once those freedoms start to disappear, it can be incredibly hard to get them back.
And then there's the whole data privacy and security issue, which feels more relevant now than ever. It can feel kind of overwhelming with these tech giants knowing so much about what we do online.
I get it. It can be a little unnerving. Think about it. They know our online habits, what we buy, who we talk to, what we like, what we're afraid of, pretty much everything. And as these companies become more and more embedded in our lives, it's only natural to worry about what could happen with all that information.
So what can we even do to protect ourselves in this increasingly complex digital world? It's a little daunting, honestly.
It can definitely feel that way, like we're at the mercy of these huge forces. But there are things you can do. I think just being informed is a good first step. The more you understand about what's at stake, the better decisions you can make as a consumer, as a citizen,
So like reading articles like the one we've been talking about today, that's the start.
Exactly. Staying curious and engaging in these conversations is key. And don't underestimate the power of your own voice. Support organizations that are fighting for digital rights and privacy. Reach out to your elected officials and let them know you care about this stuff.
All right, so be informed, speak up, and choose companies and products that align with your values. That's a good place to start.
Definitely. And don't be afraid to ask questions. This whole world of tech policy can seem pretty intimidating, but it really affects everyone. The more we understand how it works, the better equipped we'll be to navigate it and create the kind of digital future we actually want.
That's a great point. So any predictions on where this whole U.S.-Australia tech showdown is headed? Could we actually be headed towards a real trade war?
Well, predictions are always a little tricky, but I think it's safe to say this tension isn't going anywhere anytime soon. The U.S. has made it very clear they're not afraid to use their economic power to get what they want, and other countries are going to push back.
So things could get a little messy.
It's a possibility. And the outcome of this whole thing could have repercussions far beyond just the U.S. and Australia. It could really set the tone for how other countries deal with these tech giants in the future.
We're not just talking about tariffs on iPhones and Aussie wine here, are we?
Yeah.
This is about the future of the internet for everyone.
You got it. And that's why it's so important for all of us to be a part of this conversation. The decisions being made now will have a lasting impact on how we live, work, interact with each other, everything, really, in this digital age.
Well, that's a thought-provoking note to wrap things up on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the sometimes wild world of tech policy. As always, keep digging into these issues, form your own opinions, and until next time, stay curious.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.